Welcome back. Today we're going to dive into the life of someone who's very well known. He was a Baroque composer, and even if you are not into that type of music at all, or don't think you would be, it's very likely that you are familiar with this guy's name and what most people consider his magnum opus. Our Christian, every Christian should know in this episode is George Frideric Handel, composer of the Messiah. Stephen Nichols said this about Handel in his podcast, 5 Minutes in Church History. His life and work are instructive to any of us who want to pursue God-honoring excellence in our work. And Rose, from examining Handel's life and his work, I believe Mr. Nichols is right about that. But some people are trying to drag Handel's name and his Christian beliefs through the mud. And you probably won't be surprised at all to find out that it's the LGBTQ plus community who's doing it.
Shocking.
Shocking. They will do anything to undermine the truth in order to support their agendas, even disparaging a deceased Christian's name and reputation. As Tom Askell said in a recent article about the LGBTQ plus people and the movement, they are a community of unbridled depravity. And Rose, in my opinion, and I'm guessing probably in yours too, the more somebody supports and upholds that agenda, to me, the more depraved they are.
Well, Chris, you have to figure it all starts with sexual depravity. I mean, if you're gay, if you're transgender, whatever, that's sexual depravity. So you're already starting there. So it's not real hard to start going further and further down that road.
I know there's a lot of gay people that don't support all the rest of the stuff, but these people, some of them are just trying to rewrite history. And like I said, drag people's names through the mud. And we're going to get to how they're trying to do that with Handel's life and how they're trying to change his history to suit their depraved minds in a bit. But first, let's start with the truth about his life.
George Frideric Handel was born on February 23rd, 1685. It happened to be the same year as two other famous composers, Johann Sebastian Bach and Domenico Scarlatti. Handel was born in Halle, Germany. His father, George Handel Sr., was a barber surgeon. Now, he was a barber who also served as a surgeon, and that was because of his dexterity with a razor. And he mostly cared for soldiers after they were in battle, doing everything from cutting their hair to pulling teeth to amputating limbs. Imagine going in saying, "Can you cut a little off the top and take my leg off too?" I mean, it was crazy that he did both, but
well, yeah, that was kind of a common thing back in the day, but it seems so strange to us.
I guess it makes sense because they used straight razors to shave you, so they were pretty dexterous with a razor.
Yep.
His mother's name was Dorothea Taust, and she was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor from a long line of Lutheran pastors. Now, Handel's father, who was a barber surgeon but not an official barber surgeon, had a first wife named Anna, and she was the widow of an official barber surgeon. So George Sr. inherited her late husband's practice. They had 6 children together before Anna died in 1682. And a year after this, George Sr. married Dorothea. They had one stillborn son before George Frideric's birth in 1685. And then after that, they had 2 more daughters. Now, 3 of his half-siblings from his dad's first marriage had already died before Handel was even born.
From very early on, Handel longed to study music, but his father objected. He said it wouldn't be a realistic source of income. It's said that his father would not even permit him to bring a musical instrument into the house. George Sr.'s plan was for his son to become a lawyer. His mother, though, she was very supportive of him learning music, and she encouraged him to develop his musical talent, even encouraging him to practice it on the sly without his father knowing. Some people say that he hid instruments in the attic and would hide up there and practice when he could without his father knowing. Sometime around the age of 8 or 9, he accompanied his father to the city of Weissenfels, where they met the Duke of Saxe-Weissenfels, Johann Adolf I. And while they were there, young George made his way to an organ, and the accounts of how that happened are varied, but he made his way to this organ, and then he sat down and he played, and everybody was really surprised at his ability. The Duke recommended that young George be given musical instruction. And so, I mean, when the Duke says your
Yeah.
son should study music, his father relented and he allowed him to become the pupil of composer and organist Friedrich Wilhelm Zachow. And he was an organist in the church parish in their home of Hale. Handel mastered composing for the organ and the oboe and the violin by the time he was 10 years old. That just seems amazing to me.
Yeah.
From the age of 11 until the time he was 16 or 17, he composed church cantatas and chamber music.
Amazing. Chris, when you study to be a classical pianist, my daughter studied for a while, you use Handel's compositions and scales and stuff to practice because they're so complicated and they take so much skill. On February 11th, 1697, George Sr. passed away, and perhaps to fulfill a promise to his father, on February 10th, 1702, Handel began studying at the University of Halle, which had been provided for by his father in hopes that his son would become a lawyer. That's what he wanted him to be. Now, at the same time, Handel also accepted a position as an organist at the Calvinist Cathedral in Halle. His music teacher, Friedrich Zachow, had introduced young Handel to all types of music, both sacred and secular. He'd also taught him how to compose his own music, both instrumental and choral. Like you said, Chris, he wrote cantatas and stuff. While he was in Halle working at the cathedral as an organist, it's believed that he probably wrote many compositions, including vocal cantatas, since it was his job to provide suitable music for the church. However, none of those sacred compositions can be attributed to him from that time in his life. Maybe they were lost, maybe someone else took credit. We don't know. His passion for music was too great to allow him to stay at the university, though. So in 1703, at the age of 18, he decided to commit himself completely to music. And he left Halle and traveled north to Hamburg, where he joined the violin section of the opera orchestra in the Hamburg Opera's Goose Market Theater. And sometimes he would even substitute on the harpsichord. His first opera premiered in Hamburg in 1705, and the name was called Almira.
Handel traveled through Italy from 1706 to 1710, and while he was there, he met some of the greatest Italian musicians of the day. He composed many works while he was there, including 2 more operas, numerous solo cantatas, and again, some more church music. His opera Agrippina was a huge success, and it premiered in Venice in 1710. And his fame just spread across the region. People loved how he adapted to the Italian opera style, and it wasn't long until he became internationally known. In 1710, he was also appointed Kapellmeister, and that's the person who is in charge of the chapel choir. And he was appointed that under George the Elector of Hanover, who would go on to be the future King George I of England. And later that year, he traveled to England. In 1711, his opera Rinaldo was performed in London. And again, everybody loved it. The fact that Rinaldo was a hit in London had made Handel think that there might be a possibility of England being a prosperous place for him to be. In 1712, he decided to settle in England permanently and went back to London, where he produced 2 more operas. In 1713, he wrote Ode to the Queen's Birthday in honor of Queen Anne, and for doing that, she granted him an annual allowance of £200, and that'd be the equivalent of about $269 today.
Handel didn't really have a desire to return to Hanover and didn't want to continue his position as Kapellmeister. With the death of Queen Anne in 1714, George the Elector of Hanover, like you said, Chris, became King George the First of England. It was said that King George was annoyed by Handel's abandonment of his post of Kapellmeister and because he went away to England. But then in July 1717, Handel composed something called Water Music, and that was performed more than 3 times on the River Thames for King George. And it was said that that spurred a reconciliation between Handel and the king. In 1718, Handel moved to Middlesex, England, and he became the house composer in the residence of George Bridges, who was the first Duke of Chandos. Now, the Duke was a fan of the arts, and the name of the stately home and estate that he lived on was Cannons. It became a destination for the wealthy who would flock there because they were interested in art and music. Handel composed the 11 Chantos anthems and other works while he was living on the estate.
In 1719, a group of aristocrats formed the Royal Academy of Music, and that was a company that they formed to secure themselves a constant supply of Italian operas, something that was, all the rage in England then, and mainly with the upper class and the nobility. The company commissioned large numbers of new operas from 3 leading composers, one of whom was Handel, and he was also appointed as the master of the orchestra. And that was the person responsible for not only writing operas, but attracting soloists and adapting operas that they got from abroad. In May of that year, Handel was ordered to travel to Dresden to attend the newly built opera house there and try to attract some of those leading members of that cast to perform at the Royal Academy of Music. A year later, the Academy began producing those operas. They were paying out extravagant fees for some of the best performers from Italy mostly. And one of those was a woman named Francesca Cuzzoni, and she was a popular soprano. And the Academy had a lot of success during that time, even filling the house at times. And that wasn't something that was a regular occurrence then. That success led them to try to increase their audience even more by bringing another celebrated Italian opera into the mix, and her name was Faustina Bordoni. And again, she demanded an exorbitant fee for coming. You can't blame them for trying because many opera companies in Italy at the time featured 2 leading ladies. So why not try it, right?
Right.
But things don't always work out.
Now, there were many people who were enthusiastic about the 2 singers, but some London audience members started favoring one singer over the other. And if you know anything about women, that never ends well.
No, it does not.
On April 4th, 1727, some members of the audience became pretty unruly. They hissed and interrupted the performance with catcalls when the rival of their favorite was performing. The royal family was in attendance at that performance, and Francesca Cuzzoni issued a public apology to them for what had happened. But it continued, and in June of that year, with the Princess of Wales in attendance, the audience hissed and catcalled and broke out into fights. The 2 leading women also got in on the action. They were trading insults, trading blows of their own. I mean, they were catfighting. And eventually they had to be dragged apart. The reputation of the Italian opera in London became tainted, no kidding. But the 2 ladies appeared in performances together in several more operas, some that were written by Handel. The Royal Academy of Music collapsed at the end of the 1728-29 season, and Handel started a new opera company with a new soprano star. In 1729, he became joint manager of the Queen's Theatre, and he traveled to Italy to find new singers and compose new operas.
Rose, who knew the opera could be so exciting?
I love the opera, but that would be kind of like opera meets hockey.
Yeah, that's just it. It just sounds strange. I
Well,
love the opera too. I like any kind of musical thing like that. But
Maybe the opera meets professional wrestling. I don't know.
yeah, that's kind of like WWF, right?
Yeah.
Handel spent the rest of his life in England. In February 1727, he became a British subject, which enabled him to be appointed a composer of the Chapel Royal. It allowed him to write more than 40 operas and other works, including the coronation anthems for George II in 1727. In 1737, his company went bankrupt and he suffered what appeared to be a mild stroke. After being treated in Germany, where he was restored to health, he went on to compose the funeral anthem for Queen Caroline in 1737. And the opera scene in England continued to decline. In 1728, a new kind of opera was introduced in England, an opera that was sung totally in English. So up until this time, they were used to hearing it in, Italian, not English. They also changed what kind of music they used. They used lots of it based on folk tunes, some things that were very well known. So for the English public, most of whom, like I said, had watched the operas, and listened to it in Italian, now knew the words. And this was a huge, huge hit. So that gave Handel the idea of writing what's called the English oratorios. And an oratorio is a musical work typically of a religious nature, and it's performed without costumes or scenery or action. These oratorios started to become very popular too. Handel wrote two successful oratorios during this time, Esther and Deborah. He wrote two more later, one called Saul and one called Israel in Egypt. He also wrote 12 grand concertos, and during that time, he helped establish what's called the Fund for the Support of Decayed Musicians. It's now called the Royal Society of Musicians, but it was to help them out. It was in 1741 that he wrote his greatest oratorio, and that is the Messiah, obviously. It was first performed in Dublin on April 13th, 1742. And then he just kept on writing. He wrote Joseph and His Brethren, first performed in 1744, Belshazzar a year later. And he also went on to write some secular oratorios and songs.
It just amazes me that someone can just write and write and write and write and just keep writing that much. I mean,
I know.
and for the record, I mean, I love Messiah. That's absolutely beautiful. But I'm not a fan of English opera. I like the opera in Italian, even if I don't know what they're saying. Italian is a much more beautiful language than English, just the way it is.
Yes.
Handel made oratorios and large-scale choral works the most popular musical form in England. The aristocracy had loved the Italian opera despite its moral indecency that it often contained. See that? I didn't even know it contained indecency because I didn't know what they were saying. When the popularity of the Italian opera started to die out, Handel became more popular with the rising middle classes who seemed eager to be edified by a story from the Bible. Handel once said, and I'm quoting, "I should be very sorry if I only entertain them," referring to the people who listened to his music. He wanted people not only to be entertained, but he wanted them to be moved by his music. And that's certainly the case with Messiah. Messiah has three parts. Part one begins with prophecies of the coming Messiah, and it's from Isaiah and the Psalms. And then it takes us to the shepherds watching their flock at night at Bethlehem's hillsides. Part two covers the passion, the suffering, and the death of Jesus, and ends with the Hallelujah chorus, probably the most famous part of the Messiah. King George II was in the audience when Messiah was performed in London, and when they got to the Hallelujah chorus, the king was so moved that he stood up. Now, when the king stands, everybody stands. So the whole theater stood alongside the king, and that started the tradition of standing during the Hallelujah chorus part. Part three of the Messiah picks up with Christ's resurrection and continues with his ascension and what theologians call his present session and glory. Then it ends with the day of judgment that Jesus comes as the Messiah and the King, and he comes in glory. When Handel finished writing the musical score of the Messiah, He signed it SDG, which means Sola Della Gloria, which is one of the five solas.
Covers the whole New Testament.
He really does.
Yeah.
And the Old Testament, some of it.
The Messiah and some of his other oratorios stirred some controversy among church leaders who deemed it inappropriate for a quote unquote act of religion to be performed in a theater and by companies of performers rather than ministers of the word. But Handel's Christian beliefs led him to challenge that view of the secular spaces being unfit for biblical truth. In response to them, he said this: I have read my Bible very well and will choose for myself. For Handel, there was no sacred secular divide, therefore, no reason why houses of entertainment shouldn't also host the praises of God. In fact, he thought where better to sing worship than a building dedicated to the wonder of music. In 1751, Handel went blind, and in 1759, at the age of 74, he died in London. He's buried in Westminster Abbey. To quote Stephen Nichols again, I'm going to use the same quote from before. Handel's life and work are instructive to any of us who want to pursue God-honoring excellence in our work, be that in churches, concert halls, or wherever we serve. This guy, like you said, Rose, he wrote so much music. He was always busy doing music.
Yeah, it's insane. You know, Chris, one thing I've learned from all these Christians, every Christian should know, because we've done pretty much all of them have been in the past. Nabil Qureshi was pretty recent, but is they all worked hard. I mean, they made the best use of their time. They didn't waste time. They weren't lazy, and they were all about doing. To me, that's probably the most convicting.
Yeah, I totally agree with you 100%.
So that's the story of George Frideric Handel. And like we mentioned earlier, Handel's life story is being challenged by the people from the LGBTQTI plus, I don't even know what letters are there anymore, who don't want anything to be known about someone who lives a good and God-honoring life. In an article written by Matt Wood called Reclothing Handel with the Truths of History in order to reclaim him from the hands of queer theory, he explains that what happened in his musicology class in grad school, this is what he says. As I entered the class, I hoped to learn how music interacts with sociology, psychology, and history, and to possibly learn how music could help my local community. To my shock and dismay, instead, I was taught to question authority and deconstruct the great composers of Western civilization. One chapter of assigned reading that stood out was titled, Was Handel Gay? On Closet Questions and Cultural Politics from Gary C. Thomas's book, Queering the Pitch, The New Gay and Lesbian Musicology.
Mr. Wood, who from this article is obviously a very knowledgeable Christian, knew about Handel's faith and music, so he knew how absurd Thomas's claim was. But as he goes on to say, these assignments are given out to, and I'm going to quote him here, eager students who are like sheep without a shepherd. He, meaning Mr. Wood, understood what was going on, but many students don't. Many don't realize that these are historical revisionists who seek to find anything they can claim might be a trace of queerness. They attempt to read their own radical ideas right back into time, and they do it in every single field of study today. Mr. Wood goes on to tell us more about his class. He says, and this I'm quoting him, even worse, under the gaze of their all-knowing professor, deconstruction of a person's life becomes a pleasurable activity that applies to anyone and anything. To quote Thomas, the writer of Handel's chapter of the book, if the romantic impulse to construct cultural heroes is human, the ironic counterculture impulse to deconstruct them seems equally so. We thus get to enjoy our heroes twice, first in the putting on, then in the taking off of their clothes. If anything, the latter is more pleasurable. Talk about sick, Rose.
You know, I was just reading an article on The only way like these ideologies and depravities and socialism and communism can exist is if they deconstruct and destroy all our heritage. There's a candidate, I think it's in Wisconsin. She wants to outlaw Thanksgiving because there's nothing to be thankful for. But this is what they do. They rewrite history. They destroy the classics. I mean, they don't teach the classic novels and literature anymore because they want to
Nope.
deconstruct, rewrite history because they don't want people to have valued and cherished heritages because you can't control them if they have that.
Exactly.
And that's all what is at the root of all of this stuff is they want to destroy what's cherished and valued and what makes us who we are. It's the same with them
Right.
trying to destroy the Constitution. I mean,
Absolutely.
because then they can control you. If you have nothing that you cherish, they can control you.
Yep.
And I know it's a little more complex than that, but that's all that's at the base of this.
It is evil.
And this Thomas guy, much of the curriculum that he had was based on imagined conversations that Handel had with King George, where the king questioned Handel's love of women, to which Handel imaginarily or allegedly replied, I have no time for anything but music. So Thomas took things like the fact that Handel was very private, for instance, and twisted it by saying that a private lifestyle probably supported a possibility of a homosexual lifestyle. And the guy who wrote the article, Mr. Wood, he does a great job of refuting Thomas's made up stories with solid, fully researched study of George Frideric Handel's life. Imagine that. You just present them with the truth of their lies. That's the only way to fight this stuff.
Yep.
And Chris, that is how we refute all the LGBTQT lies about Handel, all this liberal, socialist, communist ideology is it's all based on lies. So just present it the truth. Just show truth. Keep speaking truth.
Absolutely. And Rose, a lot of people might say, well, why does it matter? What would it change about how the general populace views Handel's music? Well, that's a totally wrong attitude to take. It does matter. Claiming that Handel might have been gay does damage to his Christian witness. If he had lived a sinful lifestyle while writing and composing such biblically centered music, it would make him a hypocrite and a liar. These LGBTQ plus people are taking the lives of God gifted Christians who spent their lives trying to honor and glorify him, and they're mocking that glory. It is evil to the core. They're trying to revise history by plastering it with queerness. And like I said, or you said, one of us said earlier, they are doing it in every field of study. So Christians need to be aware of it. We need to teach our kids to watch out for it, and we need to be ready to argue against it. Handel was a devout Christian. His faith was what clearly motivated him to pour everything he had into his music. He did it for the glory of God. All of the true evidence points to that. And that is what makes George Frideric Handel a Christian every Christian should know.
And that's where we'll end today. Have a blessed day, everyone.